Hi, I'm Nathan from Serious Geeks, and this video is going to be a Tactica on Space Marine melee weapons and their uses on the tabletop. For the purposes of this video, the rules that we're going to assume and make use of for this Tactica will be from the Space Marine leaks that we've seen in recent weeks. Obviously, going forward, there will be more detailed Tactica relating to the new releases as and when they come out, and if there's any corrections, of course a new video will be made. Probably the most iconic weapon that Space Marines have access to, right alongside the bolter, is the chainsword, and this would be a great opportunity to start from the top. The Astartes chainsword is seeing a complete change in 9th edition. Whereas traditional chainswords just give you the additional +1 attack, the Astartes chainsword gives +1 attack as well as a -1 for the AP. Coupled with the fact that it is likely to be the cheapest out of all melee weapons, and it certainly is at the moment, it's free, although that could change going forward, and the fact that it also is widely accessible to most units in the army. Therefore, this weapon is going to be widely used by most players. If you have a close combat unit that has several models in it with various special weapons or storm shields, usually for protection, such as the Vanguard Veteran Squad, a couple of models with the Astartes Chainsword will give you a great way to add additional attacks into the unit whilst also maintaining a little bit of armor penetration, but for cheap. So it is an incredibly potent weapon to mix into units that have a lot more specialised role in the first place. Other models with access to the Astartes Chainsword would include just about every sergeant in the Space Marine lineup. There are some that don't get access to it, such as Centurion and Terminator squads, as well as Inceptors and Aggressors. However, for the most part, most units have access to a sergeant who can have an Astartes chainsword. For those that do, you have to consider whether that unit is likely to be on the front line. If the Astartes chainsword goes up by a couple of points, it will be something you have to consider. If not, if you don't give up a bolter, then you will have a lot of effect out of it, because let's be honest, it's free and it just gives a little bit of power to the squad in close combat that would otherwise not do anything. A Primaris Sergeant with an Astartes Chainsword actually has a total of 4 attacks base. Naturally, this increases with Shock Assault, so you can see that you can generate quite a lot of attacks out of a single model. It works with other units such as Chaos Space Marine units that might have a frontline capacity of bolters and plasma weapons, and you put an Astartes Chainsword on the champion, and all of a sudden you've got a model that really does contribute to the amount of attacks up and above what he actually costs. He's the equivalent of several other Space Marines. Of course, the utility of this weapon makes it a very effective choice for most people, but what makes it incredibly potent is what happens if you put it on an entire unit geared for close combat. World Eaters and Death Company spring to mind, both of which can have lots of chainswords and be able to carve through the opponent very handily. Probably the only real weakness of this weapon is how it doesn't give you a strength bonus. That, plus a mediocre -1 to the AP, means that you're not going to be able to get much out of it if you're fighting heavily armoured or even vehicle units that are coming at you. If you're going to throw a Vanguard Veteran Squad at a knight and all they have is chainswords, you're going to expect to lose them and do very little damage. Lastly, is the use on characters is quite limited. If your character is going to be engaging in close combat, then you probably want something a little bit more effective than just a chainsword. However, if you have a character who's designed for hanging back and perhaps firing at the opponent, such as a lieutenant, you will see a cheap chainsword on there as a great way of him having some close combat capacity if he does get pulled into it. As such, my final recommendation for this weapon is to add it as a utility choice to units that will be on the front line and will be likely to be engaged in close combat, especially if it doesn't cost any points in 9th edition like it is now. My second recommendation for the chainsword is to add it to units that are already quite good in close combat as a utility option to gain more attacks when you're charging into close combat and just hacking through the opponent. It's cheap, and you're going to want to lose a chainsword trooper instead of a power fist trooper for the most part. Special mention goes to World Eaters, who will have an absolutely mountain of attacks if they have double chainswords, and Death Company, who get +1 to the wound, which is very effective when all you are is strength 4, but you're hitting with so many attacks, especially as it has a -1 to the AP. Lord help us if a Death Company unit full of chainswords gets into close combat in the Assault Doctrine. The sheer amount of attacks they get at +1 to wound is just phenomenal, so we will see a lot of chainsword usage on these such units as well, and I quite recommend that. Characters, I only really recommend a chainsword if your model is not designed to get into close combat, or if you want to take the Teeth of Terror, which is a different prospect, and relics should probably be covered separately anyway. So, moving on, keeping with the theme of utility, I will go with a power sword. In 9th edition, power swords are going to a +1 strength in addition to their -3 AP. So, power swords are already effective at carving through armour, but with a Space Marine strength of 4 and the +1 to wound, we're going to see a very effective choice that is quite utilitarian at carving through troops, especially if you don't know what you're going to face in a competitive sense, or if you're just turning up to the store and you're not sure who you're going to come up against. Power swords will serve you very well. At the moment, power swords are quite cheap, and I don't really see that changing with each chapter approved that comes out year on year, so I reckon it would be quite good and effective to add a couple to your army across the board, depending on what you need to do. My recommendation in this regard is to add power swords to units that are primarily intended for close combat. Vanguard veterans spring to mind, as might do company veterans. Other units, like tactical marines and Primaris intercessors, if they're not going to be on the front line, they don't need a special weapon on the close combat option for their sergeant. If they are on the front line and you have a large number in the squad, such as 10, you can make use of a power sword for this unit because it's still fairly cheap, and if they're going to be fighting in close combat, at least they can do some damage to the opponents. This is most relevant when they're fighting like for like, so if you have, say, 5 Primaris intercessors against, say, 6 tactical marines, you're going to really struggle to be effective at killing them all quickly, whereas a power sword in the unit can chop up a couple of them fairly handily. What the power sword does give you is access to a reasonable chance at wounding most things in the game. Hitting at strength 5 means that even a toughness 8 model such as a knight will be wounded on a 5+. Not great, but much better than a 6+, and if you have quite a few of them, you can do a little bit of damage, and thus contribute to the damage output of the unit. The epitome of power sword wielding troopers is the Blade Guard. Hitting at strength 5 means that their mastercrafted power swords are doing 2 damage a lot more readily. They have quite a lot of attacks, and their only weakness really is their slow movement, as otherwise you can use these units to absolutely murder the enemy infantry. Finally, power swords are very useful for their cheap cost on a character that might be engaged in close combat but very often won't be. If you have a lieutenant or a captain who's ended up in close combat, you don't want him to be cut down or tied up indefinitely by lots of weak troops. So a power sword can actually help you out in this regard because you're going to be wounding them fairly well. Even orcs that might not have heavy armour, you're wounding them on a 3+ instead of a 4+ if you had the chainsword, and thus it's a much better weapon for self-defense. Other characters using a power sword might include the company champion, the chapter champion, the company ancient, and the chapter ancient, depending on which army you collect. From the chaos perspective, you could have something such as an exalted champion who would have access to a power sword. These sort of models, equipped with a meagre strength 4 weapon in the form of a power sword, would often not be very effective in 8th edition. However, from 9th edition onwards, you're going to see a massive upsurge in what is effective in close combat, thanks to the power sword given a native +1 to wound. The champions in particular have mastercrafted blades, which means they can do quite a lot of damage to a character model. Indeed, many character models only have 4 wounds, some have 5, but most of the support characters have 4 wounds or less within the entire game. As such, 2 wounding hits will finish off such models. Tougher characters, ones on bikes for example, will be wounded on a 4+ instead of a 5+, again thanks to the strength 5 from the power sword. Lastly, if you do get pulled into combat against a rather large vehicle, you can at least do some damage to it on a 5+, rather than relying on 6s, which is never a positive in any shape or form, because you just can't rely on that 16% chance of rolling a 6. So in summary, I believe that power swords are a great utility weapon for many units across the board in all Space Marine armies, simply because they give reasonable performance against just about everything in the game, and they are fairly moderate in cost. So moving on to probably the directest comparison, we have power axes. A lot of people compare power swords to power axes, and it's easy to understand why. One gives you an extra pip of strength, one gives you 2 extra pips of strength. One has a really powerful modifier to the AP in -3, and the other one has a rather good but distinctly average in comparison AP of -2. Both weapons are fairly cheap, and I think power axes will continue to be so, just like the power sword. So which one would you take? Well, most people will look at a power axe and say there's not really much use for it because it is very niche. But if you really break down what it does, the +2 to strength is actually a real big deal because it puts a Space Marine onto strength 6. Against toughness 5 vehicles, you're actually better off with the power sword, simply because it's got a better AP modifier rather than the actual -2 of the power axe. However, what the power axe is good at doing is killing toughness 3 models on a 2+, which means Eldari, Genestealer Cult, and if you are in close combat with Astra Militarum, it's nice to wound them on a 2+. The power axe is also very useful in toughness 5 and toughness 6 models in comparison to the power sword. So toughness 5 models, the power axe with a Space Marine strength of 4 is going to be wounding on 3+ because it's been boosted to 6. Likewise, if you do come up against anything that's toughness 6, and I think there are some really substantial close combat units in the game that do have toughness 6, such as Grotesques and the rather large mutant aberrants for the Genestealer Cult. So in those cases, it is kind of nice to wound them on a 4+ instead of a 5+. So there is a niche for power axes. However, it is very much that, a niche. I wouldn't add power axes across the board to my Space Marine army, but I would definitely add a couple in here and there to my close combat units to try and boost what they're capable of doing, just in case you come up against these units that the power axe is superior at fighting. Personally, I do rank the power axe behind the power sword, simply because it isn't as utilitarian against as many units as what the power sword might be. If you're up against people you don't know, like in a tournament circumstance, or when you turn up to a gaming club or gaming hall and you want to have a good game against people that's quite balanced, power axes will generally not be as effective unless you are just lucky in what you come up against. It's for that reason I don't really recommend adding them to characters, simply because the character could quite possibly be engaged in something he doesn't want to be engaged with, and the extra pip of -1 for the power sword would probably do better at killing those models than what the power axe's -2 might do. At the time I'm making this video, I am currently unaware of any changes to the power maul. However, I do believe it will be changing. I can't imagine it's going to keep its +2 strength when the power axe already has that, so it may very well go up to +3 or even +4. If it goes up to +4 with its mediocre -1 AP, it actually becomes a very useful cheap power fist in many regards, since it doesn't have a -1 to hit. Probably, we don't know. So I'm not going to speculate much on the power maul because we don't know how it's going to change. But as it is in the current rule set, it's unlikely to be used compared to power swords and power axes, so I'm very confident it is going to be changed, but I won't talk about it today. Moving up the scale in powerful weapons in close combat, we have the Lightning Claw, which will include twin Lightning Claws as well. This weapon is actually a firm favourite of mine, simply because it allows you to re-roll your wound rolls in close combat, which is a lot more effective than people ever give credit for. Anyone who remembers taking on Gilliman at the beginning of 8th edition will remember the full rerolls to hit and full rerolls to wounds that made him so effective, and that had to be changed to reroll 1s to wound in the end. A single Lightning Claw is fairly cheap for adding to sergeants that might be engaged in close combat, such as a Sternguard sergeant, as it gives him a chance to wound relatively easily in close combat, whilst also keeping his weapon for shooting, which is kind of the reason you want to take a sergeant such as a Sternguard sergeant in the first place. The twin Lightning Claw is where the most fun is at, because you get an additional attack in close combat, meaning if you had a sprinkling of Lightning Claws to a Vanguard Veteran squad, or a Company Champion squad, you will actually gain quite a few attacks in close combat that all manage to reroll wounds after they've already hit. They have a reasonable AP of -2, which means they will cut through armour, but just not quite as readily as a power sword. Twin Lightning Claws, very effective simply because the extra attack, are also very good on characters. Captains or lieutenants, Chaos Lords or Exalted Champions that have twin lightning claws are very good at carving through infantry. You might not have as much effectiveness carving through heavy targets simply because you've only done 1 damage per hit. However, if you have other units in your army that are designed to kill such models, then you can really chop through a lot of models using your lightning claws. Special mention must go to Terminator squads. Chaos Terminators with a single lightning claw and say a combi weapon of some sort will be very powerful on the tabletop because they can actually carve through a lot of people in close combat whilst also maintaining a heavy shooting presence. Loyalists can do something very similar using Cataphractii Terminators. They won't be as good at shooting simply because their combi weapons are limited to twin bolters. However, they have very heavy armour. Incredibly survivable with a 4+ invulnerable save and a decent 2+ armour save, a single lightning claw and a combi weapon means that Cataphractii Terminators can carve through big units very easily and put a lot of hits, which will ultimately end up being wounding hits with the lightning claw, on a lot of targets. Assault Terminators, very effective in close combat, but you probably want a couple of Thunderhammers in there because you want to be smashing large targets. However, if you do think you're going to be engaged in quite a lot of infantry models that might try and tie up the limited amount of attacks of a Terminator squad, a couple of models with twin lightning claws will really help out an assault squad for Terminators. Speaking of Terminators, we're going to move on to the most iconic Terminator weapon, which is the Power Fist. The Power Fist in 9th edition is going up to 2 damage base rather than D3, which to me is an increase in effectiveness simply because it lacks the swingy aspect of the variable that is D3. Doubling the strength of a Space Marine means that it will be very effective at wounding infantry, as well as give you relatively easy access to lots of wounding hits on a large target such as a Land Raider or a Leviathan if you are taking one on in close combat. Wounding on a 4+ against these targets isn't great, but it does give you a lot of capacity compared to what, say, a Power Sword or a Power Axe might do versus them, especially as you're actually doing 2 damage with each hit. AP -3 is very effective. It gives a lot of good performance against most targets, but there is a stock -1 to hit in the current edition, and we can assume that that will be the case in 9th edition. Starting with Terminators, every single Terminator squad that can have access to Power Fists can make very good use of them, simply because it is a fairly cheap weapon for what it does. It gives you decent reliability against infantry, which means that you can't get tied up that easily by anything that isn't a large number of models. Essentially, a Power Fist is a Marine killer. Having a stock 2 damage means that there aren't many Space Marine models that can take more than 1 hit of these things. Same as the Power Sword, if you need a frontline unit to have a bit of punch and it's only a troop's choice, a Power Fist hidden in the unit effectively by being on the Sergeant, meaning it's going to be the last model to be removed, can be quite effective counter-punch whilst in close combat, excuse the pun. Remember though, a -1 to hit means that Space Marines such as Terminators, or even Sergeants that may have access to this weapon, will only be hitting on a 4+. Unless you have a way of boosting this, either Fury the First, which will give Terminator units +1 to hit, or a Captain's rerolls, for example, I don't recommend widespread use of Power Fists, simply because you're unlikely to get the most use out of it, and hitting on a 4+ is distinctly average. If you do have access to these rerolls or these boosts to hit, then a Power Fist is very effective, and used en masse in a Vanguard Veteran squad, you can do a lot of damage for relatively cheap. For Chaos Terminators, I don't really recommend Power Fists, simply because you have access to the Lightning Claw alongside your combi weapon, and you'll be hitting a lot better with it. Cataphractii Terminators, it's kind of the same goes for them, but they do have access to Fury the First, which means they can get a bonus to hit in close combat with the Power Fist, which means they aren't as hamstrung by them. Same goes for Tartarus Terminators, but again, we're not entirely sure exactly how they're going to end up. Them and Cataphractii Terminators appear through some of the leaks to be put onto the same datasheet as a Relic Terminator squad, so what holds true for one is likely to hold true for the other. Moving on, we have the Terminator specific weapon, the Chain Fist. I have a feeling it will drop in points to below a Power Fist because it does have the swingy D3 damage. However, it does maintain a superior AP, an AP of -4 instead of -3. but against most targets this isn't going to make a big difference. It's only when you're hitting vehicles, which really is the design of a chain fist in the first place. Its D3 damage is not massively useful, simply because swingy attacks, unless they're used en masse, are going to be a bit limited, and you're not likely to have more than 1 or 2 of these in any Terminator squad. If you're taking a take-all-comers list, or in a competitive sense, a couple of chain fists in your Terminator squads can be quite useful, just in case you have to make use of that AP of -4, because there's nothing worse than an AP of -3 hitting a vehicle and that vehicle actually saving it with a couple of 6s that were luckily rolled. Also, if you're up against really heavy targets that have an armor save of a 2+, the -4 AP is going to be very effective. So there might be a place for a little bit of chain fist action on some units that might have access to them. Just 1 or 2 sprinkled in there. Again, for Terminators, I don't much recommend it because they don't have access to Fury the First, so they can't mitigate the -1 to hit. Not many characters have access to the chain fist, just the Terminator Captain, but I don't really recommend it on this model simply because it's too swingy and it's not really any more effective than the slightly cheaper Power Fist at this point, or even a Thunder Hammer. On that note, I must say that Power Fist on characters is quite a cheap way of having an effective model at punching through the opponent's armour. Since the Captain has a base value of 2+ weapon skill, the -1 to hit isn't as debilitating for them. The consistency of a Power Fist over a Chain Fist means that against most targets you can guarantee that if you get a wound and hit through, you're doing 2 damage, which means you're putting down a Space Marine every time you do so. In comparison, the Chain Fist may not be able to do so, simply because it has a D3 damage roll, which is a little bit swingy. Before we move on to the biggest weapon of all for handheld infantry, we'll go to a more specialist weapon, which is the Relic Blade. Some armies don't have access to the Relic Blade, and that is a small consideration because they usually have something that can make up the difference, such as a Power Fist, but a Relic Blade is a very effective weapon on a character. It's slightly contradictory, but the leaks for Relic Blades are shown on both the Space Marine Captain in the Command Box set and on the Vanguard Veterans, and have slightly different stats. In the case of the Captain, it has +3 to its strength, and in the case of the Vanguard Veterans, it has +2. Both versions of the weapon do show a damage of 2, which is very consistent, and that means it is a very effective weapon without incurring a -1 to hit. I highly recommend this weapon simply because it is so useful on so many different targets, and it gives you multiple damage as well as being able to carve through armour at a decent AP and give you a bonus to your strength. The very last close combat weapon that we really should talk about is the humble Thunder Hammer, which isn't that humble. Its performance is exactly the same as a Power Fist, except it has a mighty damage of 4. Starting from the top, it is most effective on a combat captain, such as the infamous Smash Captain that many people take. Multiple attacks, weapon skill 2+, this model will absolutely crucify and demolish everything it comes up against. Even if you only manage to get 2 wounding hits through to a heavy target, you're going to do 8 damage. Due to the sheer number of attacks that Space Marine Captains can generate, this model is a no-brainer for many people. However, the points went up excruciatingly high in 8th edition, and I think that will continue to be the case in 9th edition. Many people will add a Thunder Hammer to a captain and use the guy as almost like a missile. However, I don't recommend using it in such a manner simply because of the extreme cost that is incurred because of it. If you have a problem with large targets that you need to absolutely destroy, then maybe yes, a captain with a Thunder Hammer and a jump pack can be very effective. However, I would prefer to either shoot such targets or engage them with a heavy close combat squad, such as a Terminator squad or a Vanguard Veteran squad. These units will have a cheaper access to Thunder Hammers, particularly Thunder Hammer and Storm Shield Terminators, which are very tough and survivable in 8th edition, let alone moving into 9th edition. 3 wounds on a Terminator and a Thunder Hammer plus a Storm Shield means that these models are going to absolutely demolish everything they hit and to stay around to do so. Their chief weakness is how slow they are, so you'll have to put them into a Land Raider or roll very well from a charge from Deep Strike, such as teleportation. Once they're into close combat, there is very little that can withstand a charge from these models. Fury the First, again, that does mitigate the -1 to hit, so it's recommended for these units when they charge into close combat, making their thunder hammers even more effective, but also the very fact that you can accompany them with a captain who might be cheaper armed, such as with a Relic Blade or a Power Fist, and still be able to effectively tackle a lot of big targets with those weapons. I've never really recommended adding them to intercessor squads. I reckon an intercessor squad is better off shooting and it not being in close combat. The assault intercessor squad could probably take access to this weapon in the future, which is an interesting upgrade and something I would probably recommend over the actual intercessor squad getting it. But the standard intercessor squad does not need a Thunderhammer armed model. Sure, you can generate quite a lot of attacks with them, especially if you upgrade him to being a veteran, but then you're putting a lot of command points into that squad, and he's still only hitting on a 4+. Vanguard veterans can have access to this weapon, and they can do so en masse, but again, them plus company champions might struggle a little bit to get the best use out of, because they will also be hitting on a 4+. Such units will have access to power fists, and thus cheaper access to being able to damage models. But if you do need to do a lot of heavy damage to big targets, then a few Thunder Hammers sprinkled into these units could be quite effective. Ultimately, I think the Thunder Hammer and Storm Shield option for Terminators is the best way to have Thunder Hammers, followed by adding them on to a Captain. A Captain with a Thunder Hammer can definitely make good use of it, however he does become an expensive target, with his cost, base, being 50% increased just because he's got a Thunder Hammer. Blood Angels again become very effective with a Thunder Hammer, simply because they have relics that assist them in charging into close combat and making the combat. They also get +1 to wound, and if you give it to one of their captains, you're going to be hitting and wounding most vehicles and models in the game on a 3+ followed by a 2+. Even toughness 8 targets, you're going to wound on a 3+, which is incredibly effective. Special mention here goes to Thunderwolf Cavalry, who can have access to a Thunder Hammer and are very tough on the tabletop. They're able to generate strength 10 very easily, and yeah, they're going to be absolutely astonishing in close combat with a Thunder Hammer, even though it does incur a -1 to hit. That's it for the Space Marine weapons that are pretty much across the board. There are a few outliers like Death Watch, who have access to some close combat weapons that are slightly different, as well as Grey Knights, who have access to many Nemesis Force weapons that a lot of them have very different use on the tabletop. Plus things like Frost Blades and Blood Glaives for Blood Angels and Space Wolves do make a little bit of a difference to what you select. But for the most part, these weapons are what you expect to see in most Space Marine army lists, and thus that is why I've covered them. So that's it for me on this subject. Please let me know in the comments below what you think of these weapons, what you think is going to be a great addition to the Warhammer 40,000 Space Marine army, and I will catch you all soon. Please like and subscribe. Peace out.